Winter of 1942 in Leningrad didn't simply get colder. It felt like the cold was growing out of the city itself. It didn't come from the sky, not from above, but from below. From stone, from basements, from black stairwells. It climbed the walls, slipped under clothing, hid inside bedsheets, and stayed even in places where warmth was supposed to exist. Even if a stove was burning, even if someone managed to melt ice in a mug, the cold didn't leave. It only stepped back for a moment, and then returned again, like an illness. The communal apartment on 12th line of Vasilyevsky Island moved slowly now, as if the apartment itself was afraid to breathe. A long corridor, once filled with footsteps, arguments, laughter, clattering pots, and someone's radio leaking through a neighbor's door, had turned into a tunnel with no life inside it. Wallpaper hung in strips, soot stained the corners. The wooden floor creaked so loudly that people learned to step only on the boards they trusted, the ones that complained the least. The silence here was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence where everyone understands. Every extra sound is extra weakness. If you cough too loudly, someone hears it and thinks you won't last. If you moan in your sleep, they will remember you like that. And then they'll start walking around you. And once people start walking around you, you become a stranger. And strangers aren't saved during a blockade. Not because people are cruel, but because there's no strength left for someone else's pain. Everyone's hands are already occupied with their own. Maria Alexeyevna lived in the room by the window, small and narrow, with a single wardrobe that had long been empty. She was 32, but her face looked older, as if her skin had tightened and turned gray. Her eyes were sunken, yet still alive, watchful in that constant way of someone who hasn't truly slept in a long time. She lost her voice in the fall. At first it happened abruptly. She screamed, not because she wanted to, but because there was no other way to exist in that moment. She screamed when her mother lay on their shared cot, already unable to rise. She screamed through the door at the neighbors. "Help!" She screamed when someone passed down the corridor and didn't stop. Then the screaming grew weaker, as if someone was squeezing it with their hands. Then only a rasp remained. Then nothing. Her lips moved, air came out, but there was no sound. Only a dry rustle, like paper rubbing against paper. At first the neighbors asked, "Masha, did you catch a cold? Masha, do you need water? Masha, what's wrong with your throat?" She only nodded, shook her head, tried to smile, and that looked even worse than silence. After that, they stopped asking. In a blockade, questions run out quickly. They don't help. The answer is always the same anyway: nothing. Across the corridor, in the room opposite, lived Semyon Vasilyevich Kovalyov, a former radio operator of the Baltic Fleet. Old, thin, with short-cut gray hair. His right leg was a prosthetic, shrapnel back in the 20s, near Perekop. He walked slowly, with a limp, but he held himself the way a man holds himself when he once wore a uniform. Semyon Vasilyevich had a treasure, an old tube radio, a record, a wooden corpus, worn varnish, and a round glass dial with city names: Moscow, Riga, Berlin, London. The radio hadn't worked properly for a long time. The batteries had died, the antenna had snapped after an explosion in September. but every evening he still sat in front of it. Maria heard it through the partition, not words. She almost never heard words, only rhythm, the slow turn of the tuning knob, crackle, hiss, a click, then silence, then the hiss again. It annoyed her at first. Then it began to calm her, as if someone nearby refused to give up, as if in this apartment there was still a person doing something not for food, not for survival for one more hour, but for something larger. Sometimes inside the noise a thin human voice appeared, so distant it felt like it wasn't radio at all, but memory playing tricks. But it was there, and it was alive. Maria lay on her cot and listened through the wall. Sometimes it felt like that was the only sound that didn't point toward death. Sirens pointed toward death. Explosions pointed toward death. The rasp of the neighbors at night pointed toward death. But that noise, it pointed toward life somewhere far away. On the night of January 15th, she couldn't stand it anymore. She got up, threw a wool blanket over her shoulders, torn, smelling of old dust, and her mother. She reached his door and stopped, as if afraid. She didn't even know of what. Being chased away, interrupting, not being heard. She knocked 3 times, quietly, apologetically. The door opened almost at once. Semyon Vasilyevich stood in the doorway, wearing glasses with one cracked lens. His face was drawn, but his eyes were sharp, attentive. Cold. The next day, Semyon Vasilyevich really did climb onto the roof. Maria didn't learn right away. First she heard a neighbor's voice in the corridor, not angry, more frightened. "He's completely lost it, that old man. Climbed onto the roof. There's ice up there. Wind." Maria went to the window, dragged the curtain aside with effort. On the roof of the neighboring building, a small figure moved, slowly, cautiously, as if walking on thin glass. The wind tugged at his coat. Snow caught on his shoulders. It didn't look like walking. It looked like fighting the roof, the air, the ice, fighting the thing that wanted to throw him down. An hour later, he returned. He opened his door and immediately sat down heavily on the stool. His face was red. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows. His fingers were white with frostbite. But there was a smile on his lips, rare, almost boyish. He lifted his hand and showed a thick piece of cable. Telephone line. Tore it out in the stairwell. Good copper. Maria watched his fingers. She saw them trembling, not from weakness, from pain. Semyon Vasilyevich connected the cable, tightened the screws. He did it carefully, as if he were putting something alive back together and was afraid of breaking it. The radio came alive. The noise grew denser, not empty, but living. Sometimes words broke through. "Our troops are holding their positions." A voice cut in, confident, heavy, Leviton. Then the noise slammed shut again, but now the noise carried meaning. Connection was possible. From that day, Maria began to come every evening, exactly at 8. At first she stood by the door, still afraid. Then she came in, sat on the stool. Semyon Vasilyevich didn't force her to speak. He spoke himself. He told her about being a radio operator, about how you couldn't let go of the key in mirage because your fingers would lose feeling, about how sometimes you'd catch foreign voices in the ether and you'd understand the world was enormous, even if you were trapped in a steel box of a ship. When connection disappears, he said without looking at her, it feels like you died. You haven't fallen yet. You're still sitting there. But you're already dead, because no one can hear you. Maria listened and understood it wasn't only about radio operators. It was about her throat that made no sound, about her room, about how she had disappeared from life while still walking through it. One evening they caught Katyusha, the whole song. The voice was strong, though crackling with interference. Semyon Vasilyevich hummed along, almost a whisper. Maria felt her lips move by themselves. She tried to repeat a sound. At first, nothing. Then a rasp. Dry, weak, cracked. But it was sound. Her sound. Semyon Vasilyevich noticed. He didn't turn around. He just said calmly, "Try with me. Quietly. No one will hear us except us." Maria tried again, and again. The rasp grew slightly louder. Semyon Vasilyevich smiled at the corner of his mouth. "See? Your voice didn't die. It just froze. We'll warm it up." A week passed like someone flipped through it. Every day looked like the last, but every evening was different. Because in the evening there was sound. The apartment was still hungry, still cold. Explosions still rumbled somewhere in the distance sometimes. But Maria had time now, real time, an evening that belonged to her. She began to help Semyon Vasilyevich, handed him tools, held the wire while he soldered. One day he gave her the soldering iron, tiny, old, with cloth wrapped around the handle so it wouldn't burn her fingers. "Careful, don't burn yourself." Then he added, "It's not just a piece of metal, it's connection. As long as there's connection, there's hope." Maria held it with trembling hands. She soldered the wire. Crookedly, a bead of solder spread out unevenly. But she soldered it, and strangely she felt lighter, as if she wasn't only sitting and listening. She was doing something. That night they caught a report. "Our troops have gone on the offensive, near Tikhvin." Maria heard the word and suddenly whispered, "Tikhvin." The word came out badly, hoarse, but it came out. Semyon Vasilyevich froze, looked at her over his glasses. He didn't smile. There was something else in his eyes, careful respect. "Yes, Tikhvin," he repeated quietly. Maria started crying again, but not from pain this time. Semyon Vasilyevich handed her a mug. It was just hot water, melted snow. "Drink. Your voice needs to drink too." Maria swallowed. The water had no taste, but it was warm, and in her chest it became slightly easier to breathe. From that day on, she began to speak every evening. One word, sometimes two. Semyon Vasilyevich didn't rush her, didn't correct her, didn't force her. He simply listened, the way a radio listens to the ether. February brought a strange shift. They increased the bread ration, only by 100 grams. In peaceful times, no one would have noticed. In Leningrad, it felt like a gift from fate. People began to leave their rooms more often. Footsteps returned to the corridor. Even voices, quiet, breaking, but alive. Maria decided to go outside. She dressed for a long time, very long. Put on everything she had, an old coat, a wool scarf, wraps around her legs. In the hallway mirror she saw herself and didn't recognize her. A shadow with eyes. She only made it to the corner of the building. She stood beneath a street lamp with no glass left in it. Above her hung a black emptiness. Snow squeaked under her feet. The wind was so sharp it felt like it was pulling the last strength straight out of her bones. And then she saw it, scratched into the wall with a nail. "We live." Maria stared at the words like they were an order, or a promise. She returned home, knocked on Semyon Vasilyevich's door. He opened, saw her cheeks, red, alive, and understood. "You made it?" he asked. Maria nodded. Then she breathed out, gathering strength, and said, almost loudly, though still hoarse, "There, it says, we live." Semyon Vasilyevich nodded slowly. "Then it's true." That evening they caught Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. The music came heavy, like footsteps in snow, like a heart that refuses to surrender. Maria listened with trembling hands. Semyon Vasilyevich sat absolutely still, as if afraid to move and scare the sound away. When the last note ended, Maria said, "I want to learn, to speak, not in a whisper." Semyon Vasilyevich looked at her for a long time. "Then speak, every day, even one sound, even one word. I will hear it." Spring of 1942 arrived slowly. Snow didn't vanish. It turned dirty, gray, lay in patches like old cloth. Water ran from roofs, dripped into buckets people placed in corridors. Sirens howled less often. Bombs fell farther away. But fear stayed. It doesn't leave quickly. Maria spoke more and more. At first, short words. Cold. Bread. Warm. Then phrases. "Today the bread smells better. I dreamed of my mother. I remember how I used to sing." Her voice was weak. Sometimes it broke into rasp. Sometimes it disappeared again when she was tired. But now she knew. It would return. Semyon Vasilyevich told her about himself. Not much, but honestly. About his son who died in 1941. About his wife who passed before the war. About how he wanted to leave for a village, but stayed. "Someone has to fix the radio when it breaks," he said, "even if that radio is people." Maria listened and understood. He wasn't only fixing the receiver, he was fixing her. One evening the radio suddenly went silent. Not the usual silence with interference, not crackling and fading, just silence. Absolute. As if someone pulled the whole city out of the world. Semyon Vasilyevich checked the wire, shifted a tube, turned the knob again. Nothing. Maria stared at the radio as if it had died. And in that moment she realized something. She had gotten used to the sound. She couldn't live without it anymore. It frightened her. Semyon Vasilyevich stood up sharply, too sharply for an old man with a prosthetic leg. He went to the stove, took out a small wrapped bundle. Maria didn't understand at first. Then she saw a battery, still working. He held it like something sacred. "Saved it," he said, "for the worst day." He connected it. The radio hissed again. At first quietly, weakly, then stronger. And that hiss wasn't just electricity, it was proof they weren't completely cut off. Maria exhaled and suddenly said, "I was scared." The words came out on their own. No struggle, no preparation. Semyon Vasilyevich looked at her and nodded. Being scared is normal. It's worse when you stop being scared. That means you don't care anymore. Maria lowered her eyes, then said, "I thought I'd never speak again." He answered calmly, "You're already speaking." One evening when the air outside felt especially damp and heavy, Semyon Vasilyevich placed a small bundle on the table. He untied the cloth slowly, carefully, as if afraid to damage what was inside. It was a piece of sugar, tiny, almost transparent. Maria stared at it the way people stare at a jewel. Semyon Vasilyevich dropped it into a mug of hot water and stirred with a spoon, then handed the mug to her. "Drink." Maria didn't take it right away. She knew the price of sugar. She knew people traded it for bread, for firewood, for life. "Don't look at me like that," he said quietly. "I'm not a hero. It's just your voice is coming back. And sometimes a voice needs something sweet to remember that life can be normal." Maria took the mug with both hands and sipped. And something inside her clicked, like a door unlocking. A memory. Childhood. Tea with sugar. Her mother nearby. A warm kitchen. The memory hurt so sharply she almost couldn't breathe, but it was good too. She whispered, "Thank you, Semyon Vasilyevich." And for the first time, she said his name out loud. He lowered his eyes, silent for a moment, then said, "You know, when my son was little, he lost his voice too. Bad cold. Couldn't speak. And I sat next to him and turned on the radio, so he'd hear the world wasn't dead." Maria looked at him and understood. He wasn't just telling a story. He was handing her something he'd carried for years. "And what happened?" she asked. Semyon Vasilyevich went quiet. He turned the tuning knob as if trying to hide the pause inside the sound. "He spoke again," he said at last. And then he was gone. Maria didn't answer, because there were no right words. She simply stayed, listening to the radio, listening to his breathing. Then came a day Semyon Vasilyevich called unbelievable. The radio caught a clean signal, almost without interference. The announcer's voice sounded steady. They spoke about the city holding on, about supply lines, about hope. And for the first time, that word didn't sound like a dream. It sounded like a fact. Maria walked to the window and opened the vent. Cold air rushed in, but it didn't smell only of frost. It smelled of smoke, water, and the future. Maria turned back to Semyon Vasilyevich and said clearly, without rasp, "Thank you." Semyon Vasilyevich shook his head. "For what? You brought your voice back yourself. I only turned the knob and raised the antenna." Maria smiled, a real smile. "Then, let's keep listening. Together." He nodded. "Let's." They sat down again. The radio hissed, caught interference, voices, music. The communal apartment grew a little louder. Someone coughed without hiding it. Someone spoke in the corridor. Someone even laughed, quietly, carefully, but laughed. And in Semyon Vasilyevich's room, there were two voices now. One old, calm, the other younger, still thin but alive, gaining strength. They spoke, they listened, they lived.